Now that we've identified risks, we got to talk about what we're going to do to treat them. So you can treat it different ways, but one thing you can't do is you can't ignore. So I often say that the primary duty of a CISO or a virtual CISO is to let the senior leadership, executive leadership, and board of directors know about the threat environment as completely as possible so that they can make risk-based decisions. They're the ones who must address it. And there's really four ways that you can address risk. You can avoid it, you can transfer, you can accept the risk, or you can mitigate the risk. Now, sometimes we might jokingly say that some organizations tend to have another way. They want to ignore that the risk exists, and that is not a valid risk mitigation strategy. So let's dive a little bit more into this, because we have to understand what strategy we're going to do to address the risk, and then figure out a risk treatment plan from that. What is a risk treatment plan? It's just simply a plan that outlines how the organization will manage each of the identified risks, so that you want to bring it to within acceptable risk levels, or as we often say, the risk tolerance as defined by the organization. It's the business, again, that determines the best course of action using one of the four strategies. So let's go through those strategies a little bit more in detail. So we have avoiding risk. That's eliminating the cause of the risk entirely. So really what this is that if you have, like, say, information somewhere or a legacy application that's no longer being used, instead of keeping that information, or instead of keeping that legacy application, since there's no business case for it, there's no reason to keep it if there's no reason that we're not using it. So you avoid the risk by eliminating the cause of the risk altogether. Now, you can also transfer the risk. One of the more simple examples of this is cybersecurity insurance, or cyber liability insurance. So you have a risk that the security risk itself, the liability of, is then assumed by the insurance company. You can accept the risk, and sometimes we as technology and security practitioners, we have a little struggle with this, because we view risk in our own world, and we think that, well, this is a high risk, it must be mitigated. But the C-suite and the board of directors, they view risk from a holistic viewpoint of the entire company. There's other risks involved besides information security risk. So they'll make the decision whether or not to accept it or not based on that broader view. This is, again, one of the reasons why it's not up to us as security practitioners to make the decision to avoid the risk or do any other treatment. Finally, you can mitigate the risk. You can implement controls that can bring the either likelihood or the impact, or both, of the risk, if it's realized, down. Remember, we talked about how risk is really just a product of likelihood and impact. So one example would be, like we talk about ransomware. To defend against it, organizations often deploy endpoint detection and response software and other tools. So this is mitigating the risk of ransomware through those tools, which again we refer to as controls. So how do you create a risk mitigation plan? Well, first you start out, this is one way to do it, to create action items. And then, of course, prior to all this, again, remember, you have to have all the risks identified, defined, and ranked so that they can be prioritized. So for each one of those prioritized risks, you want to define specific actions that need to be taken. Make sure you also understand and document who's going to be responsible for this, because a lot of times action plans will have generic statements but not be assigned to anyone. I've been a big fan of the RACI type of approach, where responsible, accountable, informed, consulted. At the very least, there's no ambiguity as to who is responsible for what. Then you assign the resources. There could be tools that you need to bring in place. You might need to increase your budget. You might need to bring some personnel in. Depends upon the risk. This is all weighed against the mitigation strategy. And then finally, once you are ready to go forward, you need to communicate the plan of mitigation with the appropriate folks in the organization. Sometimes that's the entire organization. Like, for example, it could result in downtime your mitigation actions of a particular service or even the main product of the company. Now, I used the word control before. Let's dive just a little bit deeper into that for a little clearer understanding. When I say controls, really, it's just very simple. These are just action items that are put in place to help to mitigate a risk. We can divide it into three groups. There are different ways to really look at controls. You have preventative controls. Now, these are controls that, well, self-explanatory, prevent things from happening. So a firewall, for example, it can prevent unauthorized connections coming into your network. Multi-factor authentication, it can prevent unauthorized logins onto resources on your network. Detective control. So these are things that you're looking for stuff. You want to find something before it's exploited or before serious damage is done if there's been an infiltration. So your SIM or your intrusion detection systems, well, they're detective controls. Corrective controls are sometimes also could be managerial controls. These are processes you put in place in order to have beefier processes and actions so that to mitigate the chance of something happening. So an incident response plan is probably the most common one. You have an incident response plan in place in order to mitigate the risk of downtime if something happens. Now, there's one other group of controls that I want to quickly touch on, and that's the concept of primary and compensating controls. A primary control is exactly what it sounds like. It is the primary thing that you're doing to mitigate a risk. So you don't want bad network traffic on your network, so you implement a firewall. Firewall is a primary control. Compensating controls are those controls you put in place in case you can't, for whatever reason, there could be valid business reasons why you couldn't allow for the primary control to be put in place. So as an example, multi-factor authentication, you might have a system on your internal network that for legacy reasons or business process reasons, it's not possible or practicable to implement multi-factor on that particular device. So your compensating controls would be along the lines of, well, we have limited accounts that have access to that. We have limited ways to have access to it. It's on our internal network, so it's protected by the firewall. It's also on an internal VLAN, which only 2 or 3 machines, for example, on the network have access to. So while you don't have the primary control in place of multi-factor for that particular device, you have other controls in place to mitigate the risk. And remember, that's really what we're looking for here. When all is said and done, implementation of these controls is not the end game in itself. It is to mitigate risk. Now, there's always going to be, one final point, there's always going to be risks that can't be mitigated completely. It's impossible and things happen. I briefly mentioned about the incident response plan before. You want to make sure you have a solid incident response plan in place for those risks that you can't fully avoid or transfer or mitigate. This ensures there's such a plan that you can quickly detect, maybe through one of those compensating controls, contain and recover from any security incident that has been caused by some sort of a risk out there.